It's not something you could do once a week or once a quarter and think that you're going to get into a challenging situation and feel like you have your battlefield armor on, because as you mentioned, Home Depot, you got triggered. It comes whenever. The battlefield can be 24/7 for some people. And so by having some of this resiliency and being able to include mindfulness practices, cognitive behavioral therapy, talking to a mental health professional, stress management, talking about that. Emotional intelligence is another really good discussion topic. Talking about anger, talking about fear. I wish we would talk more about some of these emotions, as we're doing shift change or as part of our, daily train when we're on the job, because I do think by normalizing what we call fear, normalizing what we call stress, normalizing what we call anger, it does make people self-aware.
Thank you for tuning in to the Critical Conversations podcast, brought to you by Mind the Frontline. Established in 2023 as a 501c3, Mind the Frontline is your ally in the journey to support those who selflessly safeguard our communities. Their core mission revolves around pioneering innovation and research, education, and overall well-being specifically tailored to healthcare, military, and public service frontline first responders. The Critical Conversation podcast is a dedicated space for police, fire, EMS, allied health workers, dispatchers, air medical, and military personnel, along with their families. Here, we dive into the heart of the matter, tackling essential topics such as mental health strategies, recovery methods, treatment options, the latest research, and professional development opportunities. Before we dive into today's episode on Critical Conversations, we do want to, however, acknowledge the nature of our discussions. Some of the content discussed may be triggering or intense as we explore the challenges and the triumphs within the first responder community. We recognize that these discussions may evoke strong emotions or memories. If you or someone you know is struggling and needs immediate support, we urge you to reach out to your agency's mental health resources or your local peer support group. In time of mental health crisis, you can always contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by phone or via text at 988. Please remember, you are never alone and help is always available. At Mind the Frontline, we are more than just a podcast. We are a community committed to fostering resilience within the entire first responder family. So whether you're on the front lines or supporting those who are, we invite you to subscribe, engage, and be a part of this vital mission. To learn more, please visit us at www.mindthefrontline.org. Now let's dive into today's Critical Conversation.
Welcome to another episode on the Critical Conversations podcast by Mind the Frontline, the podcast for first responders, mental health advocates, listeners, and the Mind the Frontline community members. In today's episode, we're actually going to have a hard discussion about how to deal with patients who die in our care and just observing death in general in the emergency setting. Our guest speaker for this episode is one of Mind the Frontline state ambassador volunteers, Nick Carson, who's been working in emergency services for well over 14 years. He's currently working at the University of Vermont Health Network in Burlington. Nick is also the host of the 321 podcast and is a nationally recognized conference speaker. He is passionate about his advocacy for mental health and training amongst first responders to help support a long and healthy career. We hope to educate you, the first responder community, on how you can use some of these tools and just having these conversations by normalizing the discussion, destigmatizing what we're seeing around mental health, and just normalizing, once again, making these conversations around the water cooler, at shift change, off duty, just normal. Because as we have these conversations, we actually are giving away the power of what it holds over us. And you find a lot of tremendous benefit about getting some of this stuff off your chest. So if this relates to you, by all means, we want you to jump in, listen, subscribe, and be a part of the conversation. So now let's get started and have some tough conversation around death and dying and kind of losing our patients in the field. Welcome. So Nick, I really appreciate you making it on today's show. Go ahead and introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I appreciate you having me on the show. I think this is a really kind of a passion project for me, just talking about this with anyone that's willing to listen, because it's something that I wish I had about 10 years ago. It's something where when I was preparing to go into this field, there was a lot of emphasis on getting a good education, taking your EMT classes, getting good grades, getting hands-on clinical experience, your physical aptitude, going out, hitting the gym, staying out of trouble, all these pieces of how to get a job in this field. And then I got a job in this field, and I started seeing stuff that my brain maybe wasn't super ready for as a teenager. And it never really went away. It just continued to add to the files in my brain of things that we're seeing that are challenging, just like all of us see. And I think we can do a little more about preparing people for that. I think we can do a little bit of a better job of treating our minds like we treat our bodies. You wouldn't compete in a World Cup without doing some training first, and we wouldn't fly in a helicopter and deal with the most critical patients in the pre-hospital system without a little bit of mental preparation. So I started actually back in 2010. My mom was driving me home from school or something, and we passed the volunteer fire station. They had a sign out front for like cadet program, and my mom's like, "Oh, you should try that. You'd like that." It's like, yeah, I don't know. I'm pretty happy with my pimped out vehicle and my sports games and all my high school stuff, but I did it anyway. And I went to the first training. I'm like, man, this is the cat's pajamas. It's like team sports with the adrenaline junkie side mixed in. And so from there I was hooked. I went to college up in Burlington, went to fire school up there. They have a combined fire 1 and 2 program. I was like really into the firefighting, and at that time everyone was like, "Oh, you have to be an EMT to get a job." And I was like, "All right, fine. I'll just do the EMT, and I won't do anything else with this, but at least I'll have the resume." So I got my EMT, and I actually liked it way more than I thought I did, and ended up getting hired paid on call. Did that for a few years, and then actually went full time in the city of Burlington. Worked there for about just over 7 years, working on a ladder company and a paramedic unit out there, and really enjoyed my time. And the more time I spent in that career, the more I realized just how much good you can do in emergency medicine. I mean, I was waiting for like the Bronx is burning style fires every week, and it's just not what I experienced on the fire trucks. But I was doing cardiac arrests and cardioversions and intubations and really sick people that really need help, and that was really rewarding. And I kind of started getting more interested in medicine just because that felt like where I was being used the most, and I could really dive into it. And eventually started chatting with some folks out of the Burlington International Airport. They have a helicopter here, a medevac helicopter. I was like, man, that would be really cool. And I did a ride along middle of July, and man, it was just back to back. We were going all over. I mean, at one point we're standing on a rooftop down in like southern New Hampshire, looking at the sunset, and we just dropped off some like STEMI cath patient. I'm like, man, this is the life. So from there, I just started making connections, and now I actually work for that same program. And that's really, really a special place to work. And I really, really enjoy that style of medicine, and interacted with IAMed and some folks from your organization before. And then at that conference, EMS World Expo, we were able to chat a little bit, and it was really rewarding to find some folks that have been around, done a little bit of work, and kind of had this experience and are willing to offer me a slot at Mind the Frontline. And so I put my application in, and I just try to help any way I can, and so impressed by what you're doing, and proud of being a part of it.
Well, man, and you're actually making a difference. The blogs that you put out for our readers and our community, I think, are extremely impactful, and they come from the heart, which is really important. And I like how you mentioned, just like we put these values around, knowing all of our procedures, knowing the different kind of updates in medical care, whatever that might look like. And, for law enforcement, or if you're a veteran or an active duty military, that could be a little bit different for you, but it's just keeping up with the new. But there is so much expectation when it comes to first responders, dispatchers, lifeguards, ski patrollers, as far as how they need to be able to operate, as far as a skill, knowledge, and abilities level, right? So you look at your KSAs, but we don't put a lot of emphasis, like you mentioned, I feel like, on incorporating mental health and wellness training and education as part of our daily routine, kind of to make that a part of a holistic kind of approach, not just these 3 KSAs, but adding in a mental health component, because we all know we experience tough days. And I'm like you, when I got into this, I was a teenager as well. I was 18 when I was going through the cadet. By 19, I had graduated and had my EMT and fired, and I still remember some of those calls. But what I don't recall, like I remember all the good EMT training from what I can remember, as you're getting fire hose as a new EMT student. but I don't recall very much other than like, this is eustress, this is, the different types of stress, and basically eat well and sleep. Like that was, and work out. That was like the three things they really kind of taught me, way back in my EMT school days. But they really didn't give me any tools about like, okay, when you start feeling some of these emotions after calls, when you start seeing death, nobody really sat me down even after like my first one. And maybe it's just because I didn't know. I didn't know, like, maybe it was okay to maybe ask my mentor or my senior firefighter, like, hey, can we sit down and kind of talk about that call? Because, I think, at least in the fire service or in public, emergency medicine, it's more or less, hey, it happens and you just kind of get used to it. Right. And I don't think we should get used to it. I think we should be trained on what to expect, how to navigate some of those feelings, those emotions, and because they do come. And then, hey, what to look out for as far as signs when these emotions and maybe these thoughts start getting intrusive and really start impacting my day-to-day life and me as a person, me as a human, because I get that so often. Like, well, it's like, hey, you're a first responder, you get paid to do this. Yeah, I get paid to care for other people. And I love that joy and that passion, just like you do, Nick. But at the same time, like, I'm still human. The human body was not meant to see that much grief and trauma. And sometimes we see it on a higher scale. Sometimes it waxes and wanes in our career. Um, but at the same time, I do believe we need to have some of these tools. And I think it is important to talk about, like, how do we process grief and loss, and how do we kind of talk about these feelings? How is it normal to feel like this, and what should I expect? If there was a new EMT student or new firefighter coming out of the academy and they're new to the job, they haven't worked in EMS before or public safety, what are some of the processes or what are some of the thoughts that you have that you would want to turn around and tell that new hire, that new recruit, as far as, processing grief and loss?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually had the ability to run a training company for a bunch of years, and I really enjoyed that process, really got into education. And my last 2 years at my career department, I was actually assigned to the training division. I was the lead recruit academy instructor for all the new recruit academies that would come in. So I ran them for the first 16 weeks, basically from the day they show up to pick up their job shirt to the day that they get released to a company and go on to probation. And so one of the things we talked about a lot in that recruit academy is not only, how do we perfect the skills and the knowledge base of what they're supposed to do, but also how to get them in touch with how their mind works and feel emotions and deal with emotions before they get on the street. Because you might be, even as an EMT, you might be trying to have a conversation with an individual who's intoxicated after a bar fight, and you need to be very careful about how you communicate with that person. You can't let your frustration come out. You can't get into a verbal altercation. I mean, you're the professional. You need to be able to manage yourself no matter what the scene throws at you. So we would try to do things in a way where we would expose the recruits to small amounts of different types of emotions and then help coach them in their own like reflective process as to what that's contributing to their own body. So for example, we might be doing an exercise and we might put someone in a tight space as a firefighter, right? Where they have to take their pack off and crawl through a really tight space in a wall. And if they get frustrated or they get overwhelmed or claustrophobic and they panic, it'll be very difficult for them to be successful. But that's a really controlled environment where we can slow them down, we can walk them through how it works, and they'll have a senior member or an instructor right next to them the entire time, just reminding them, hey, you're not alone. Take a breath. What do you notice? This is going to work. Remember your training. Let's work through this. Like that coaching of, in the moment when they start to get derailed and that sympathetic nervous system starts increasing, having that mentor to say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
take a breath. Listen to your breathing. What do you notice? Like teaching them how to reflect like that, because it may seem, kind of small that we're doing these little things of, oh, you can't get your glove on and you're frustrated, work through this problem. But that all translates because we're not teaching the skill itself. We're teaching like the fundamental problem solving ability that you can apply to any skill. And that includes people's mental health. And I think that's really important because for a long time that wasn't the case. It was very outcome focused. Can you do this skill? Yes or no? I don't care how you feel about it. Just can you do it? And how fast can you do it? And now we're more focused on, how good of a problem solver can you be and how well can you manage yourself under stress? And I feel like that's hopefully leading to a longer, more fruitful career for people because they walk into their career with that skill set. So if they step out of the fire truck or the ambulance and the family screaming and the patient's, really critical, and, maybe it's a kid or something, you have that ability to go, oh, I'm starting to breathe rapidly. I'm noticing this. I'm going to take a second. I'm going to ground myself. And I think that skill set is probably the most important thing that we started introducing. And I've had feedback from folks that made a huge difference.
That's awesome, because I can remember those moments when we had the confined space drills and things like that, and they shut off your air pack. And
Yeah.
I can tell you at 18, I did not react very well. It was all about like, oh my God, the world's falling, the world's falling, what am I going to do? It totally freaked me out. And you're right, and it just begs the question, if you're, one of these mentors or trainers out there, when you're in some of these, because you're going to do these skills and as part of the training, as part of the education, but being able to basically switch the paradigm and switch the focus from, because the fire academy for my side was more drill sergeant, right? More kind of military base kind of, training, tough love kind of thing. And I'm not saying that we need to get rid of all of that, or maybe we do. But I also like how you put like, it's the ability, like in that moment, instead of like having a drill instructor basically tell me like, hey, stop freaking out, like get your shit together, things like that. It's like, hey, Chris, like, what are you feeling right now? Okay, I feel really overwhelmed. Okay. And getting used to those feelings, because those are the exact same feelings you're going to feel in an entrapment situation like that. Like I have been hung up by wires and trapped, and that is an extremely scary situation. And I can tell you that, you try not to panic, but all the things are going through your head in that moment, and you're just trying to rechain your training. But it would have been nice to have the mental aspect of that as well, to be able to ground myself, take a couple of breaths, and be able to then now move forward, more decisively with more clarity, more importantly, to execute the job or the task at hand. Because how many times it is that, that we step off the truck, we get out of the helicopter, get off of the rig, grab the stretcher, and I've had several of these calls where you have family members there, you have bystanders there, and everybody's yelling at you, trying to tell you to do your job or do this, or they're criticizing you, and you have a critical patient, and there's just a lot going on in those moments. And I remember early on in my career, and I still would get this even on my flight days, like you try to bring the calm to the storm, but I would get overwhelmed getting just by stepping off the box or getting out of the helicopter. It'd just be like, you're immediately overwhelmed with this sense of fear. You're already kind of having this anxiety as you're going to the call, especially if it's a critical call in nature. But then you get on scene, and to have like all the hyper stimulus all there at once while you're having this anxiety, like that training that you just talked about, I feel like would be very beneficial for new hires and new people in the academy, because they learn how to, okay, I can accept this emotion. I can then now have the tools to kind of work through it, so I can bring bring myself, bring my mind, bring my thoughts back to center, and be able to go to the next task that needs to get handled. Because oftentimes what I'd find myself doing is, man, you just get really hyped up on scene, and then that comes out through your patient care. You're kind of hustle, you're moving, you make a little bit, maybe you're moving too fast and you trip on yourself. But then I remember after the call, like, dude, talk about the drop off, right? It's almost like an emotional hangover, because you were in this extreme fight or flight kind of situation with your sympathetic nervous system just in hyperdrive, really. And then you drop them off and you're like, oh, holy cow. Like, but you don't actually like, process that, in a good, healthy way sometimes, right? You just kind of stuff it down and you don't really take a moment. So I would even like encourage like, hey, even after the call, check in with your emotions and kind of do some of these things.
Yeah, I think you're 100% spot on. And, and we do still have the very regimented, classic, fire service movie drill sergeant experience. The big change we made is that's not the first thing they get. We're going to be transparent about what we're doing to their mind and what we're doing, and how we're manipulating their thought process to make them successful. And what I used to always tell people is like, imagine you're sitting at the train station and the train never slowed down for you to get on. That's basically what my recruit academy is like. It's like, hey, we're the big bad career fire department. You're a new guy, pick it up or get out. And it was like this train's flying by and you're trying to grab onto it as it goes by and it's ripping you off your feet. And so my job is, let's get that train down to speed that you can step onto. And then we're going to get right back up to speed where everyone else is. And you're going to feel good because you won't even really notice that transition. And I think that's like the training mentality we have. And you mentioned about, landing the helicopter and getting into these scenes. And one of the things I kind of mentioned around my agency is like, no one calls a helicopter because things are going amazing. Like you should be prepared to show up and have nurses sweating, doctors yelling, patients screaming. Like that's why they call air medical. Like they're not calling us because somebody has a hangnail and everyone else is busy. They're calling us because they need that level. That's why you have to have 3 to 5 years of experience before you even apply, and they're looking for senior members, and usually they combine physicians, nurses, RTs, paramedics, on these helicopters, because we need these teams that have that depth of experience to pull from. And I think joining fire and EMS, you don't always have the luxury of being paired with the senior flight nurse or a senior flight medic or somebody that has that skill set. And I think the recruit academies and the hiring programs, it's really on them to try to think about how you're going to take care of these people, and get them into the field and make sure they have a long and healthy career. Because if you don't give them the coping skills or any sort of ability to manage themselves under stress, these things just compound. Even things that you don't think would compound can compound. That blog post that's going to be released, I write about like the anxiety that you might encounter from working with a boss that's unpredictable. That can create provider burnout. And I've seen people leave jobs just because they don't like who they're working for, and they don't have the coping mechanism to work through that problem. And like any good therapist will tell you, you're not going to change that 27-year captain. You're not going to go into his office and like make him into a fuzzy pussycat just because you put a birthday hat on him. You're gonna have to learn your own mechanisms to try to keep yourself calm.
Well, and it's important when you have some of these coping skills, because when you're processing grief and loss, you look at the emotional impact of losing patients on first responders. I remember a lot of those calls, when I would lose a patient, people ask me like, how many flights have you been on? Honestly, I don't know how many patient care flights I've been on, but I can spit off the number of fatalities I've had during my career, because those don't go away. And trust me, it's not like a number I'm proud of and what I want to count, but it's just those are the ones that stick with you. So having that like subsequent grief and loss experience, not having good coping skills is like going out on the battlefield without any armor and saying like, "Hey, I'm going to be okay." I got my jujitsu. No, like you need to have some sort of armor. This, we've talked about before, just that mental armor. And that's where having some of this exposure, having good mentors, at least from the mental health and wellness side, because we're seeing a lot of new recruits and older recruits like myself that came into this industry and just did not have good coping skills. I had almost probably none, and my emotional intelligence was probably at zero. And it's just because that wasn't something that, was instilled in me in my childhood. It just didn't. And I had childhood trauma. And you see how that all kind of just pours over, and we basically mimic what we've been doing. So, sometimes I would find myself kind of acting kind of like the 8-year-old in me. My 8-year-old would kind of come out, is what I'd tell some of my partners. But you kind of have to learn some of that. When you look at the research, it does suggest that like exposure, like you mentioned, to patient deaths can lead to various psychological challenges, and we know from PTSD and depression and anxiety are a lot of those. I looked at a study published by the Journal of Emergency Medicine, GEMS, that found like emergency technicians, obviously, and paramedics, we have higher burnout rates. Like the burnout rates right now are astronomically high. I think the pandemic accelerated it, but it was already high to begin with. We just didn't know how to deal with it. We didn't want to talk about it. And now that more and more people are finding that courage and that strength to really kind of talk about and say, "Hey, I'm burned out," and more importantly, being able to recognize those signs of burnout, because there's a lot of people out there that are burned out and have no idea. They're like, "Hey, why am I agitated all the time? Why am I lethargic? Why is it when I come home, I just want to check out, not hang out with anybody?" These are all the signs. And so if you have some of the training, once again, you should have armor, but more importantly, like you should practice with your armor. And so when these events do happen, because they will happen to you, you have a layer there that can help you become more resilient. We talk about like neuroplasticity. I think about like elasticity, right? Like on a rubber band. If I can work that in, I can rebound a little bit quicker. And not only that, like I have the tools and the wherewithal to pick out what tools do I need to overcome this obstacle, versus kind of being out there kind of naked without any armor and kind of wandering around like a new recruit still, because that's really what you are. You're a new recruit on paper. You may be a senior firefighter on paper, but in your mental headspace, like you're still a booter, you're still a new recruit. Like you really don't have a handle on what it takes to be mentally resilient and have that mental armor and the strategies for coping with grief and loss. Yeah, sometimes we debrief about these. I mean, I remember the cliche, man, like, and I'm sure you can relate to this, Nick. It's just like, hey, how did that call go? Cap would be like, it went all right. And that was the end of it. But you're still dealing with all these unresolved emotions and questions, and you're trying to hack this away and organize it in your mind. And if you don't have these opportunities and we don't start normalizing these conversations, because that's what we need to do. Like, in order to become more mentally resilient, we need to help our new recruits and ourselves, more importantly, being able to process, what it is to grieve and lose somebody, because still at the end of the day, and I felt like I was that callous individual where I was just numb, and man, we lost another one. Oh, well, like, not my problem, not my circus, not my monkey. I did my job. I got them to the trauma center or wherever they needed to go, and back in the helicopter, let's go, and I would check out. And that wasn't the right thing to do. I see that now because I'm paying for that now. I am. And for those of you out there listening to this, I would encourage you to just start having really good conversations, peer support groups, access to mental health resources like Mind the Frontline. Really something is better than nothing than walking out on that battlefield with no armor.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And, I think I really believe that this is on a lot of our mentors and senior leadership is we have to instill a culture where it's kind of expected that we're going to be touching base with individuals and checking in on them and being there to support them, because asking a brand new member to reach out and ask for what they need is a big lift. And I think a lot of departments where they go wrong with these peer support teams and with a lot of these mental health programs is they go, if you need help, reach out. And one of the things I really liked when I was talking to
Reactive.
you and you and Amy and Brett and all that is if the chief comes in to your union meeting and goes, hey, if anybody's got stuff going on in your head, call this number. All right. Like, and we'll help you if you need help. That's a very different pitch than, hey, I utilize these people. They were great. It really helped me out. Like, feel free to utilize them. I encourage it. It won't affect your career. Like, come talk to me personally as like Chief Dave. It doesn't need to be like chief of department. If you need something, just reach out and I'll connect you. Like, I'm using this. I'm, practicing my own journey. That's a very different pitch. And I think a lot of departments, they have senior leadership buy-in, but it's just, they post the number and they go, if something's wrong with you, call. And if you're brand new and you're looking at the 25, 27, 30-year chief and he's like, I don't need that, but if you need it, like if you need some support, like go ahead. Like, it makes you feel like you're less than them. Whereas, taking space with these recruits and saying stuff like, hey, it appears to me that, that was a pretty stressful call. Like, do you feel like it was stressful? What did you notice about it? Like, how are you feeling now? And, and reminding folks, one of the things that I never was prepared for is that this stuff follows you home. It's not just at work.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's like, well, we leave work at work and you change out of your gear and then I put my home life on. And many times in my career, something atrocious would happen. It's a small community where I live. You come home and you're getting a coffee and you look down and there's something on the news, or there's a picture of the car, or there's a featured story about the victim that you just treated and how amazing of a person they were. And your brain is like, is disconnected because you're like, man, this person was, this volunteer and this great human being, and here's a beautiful picture of them at their senior graduation, and you have in your memory this idea of what they looked like when you saw them, and your brain's like, it can't do it. It's like, what this is what I see, and this is what is I'm reading about. What, this doesn't make any sense. And that is what starts to happen is your brain starts to like shear because it can't connect what you looked at with what you're hearing. And it took me a long time and a lot of talks with a lot of people to figure out that that's like a known issue. That's like a moral injury where you have this like differentiation between what you experience and what's happening to you versus what you believe and what should be happening. And that can cause like a fissure in your head, in your mind. And just letting these young people know that like that can happen and probably will happen. And just being aware of it is like 90% of the battle I found.
Dude, what you just said was so powerful. I want to kind of circle back on that one. When you talk about carrying it home, because when I talked about like being that guy who didn't care, it still follows you home, right? And I remember several times that exact feeling, like what you just said, hit me. Like I got the goosebumps, I got the hives, because I do remember. I remember going on some serious calls that ended up making the news, and I'll just be hanging out with my wife, that night when I'm off duty, and all of a sudden the news will come on, talking about this tragic accident, and you see the scene, you see the things, and all of a sudden I start having these flashbacks, and and they're right, they have this nice picture of that patient on the TV screen, maybe from high school or in their graduation pic, or just looking like a beautiful human. And your brain, I like that disconnect, that mental disconnect that happens, that then provides inner conflict. Right? I started really kind of questioning myself a lot, because what ended up happening is I'm seeing this beautiful person, they did great things, or a mom, whatever that circumstance would be. Most of these patients are great human beings that are trying to do great things in this world. Some of them are younger, some of them are older. But when you see that, it's like, that's not what I saw. I saw that scene that the news just shown, and then you go back in your mind, you're replaying, and you start playing like the what ifs, and should I have done that? And you really start questioning yourself, and you get in your head. And I didn't know how to get out of my head. I do think talking about like, hey, how are some of those things? What can we do when we see? Because that's going to happen, and especially for people who are walking around right now with no armor on, they go on and have a serious call, and all of a sudden it pops up in the news, social media threads. Like, media is everywhere nowadays, folks. You just can't get rid of it. So I want to circle back to that, but before we move on to that and have you respond to that, I do want to just emphasize the whole leadership thing, because this is exactly what my talk is on with the upcoming EMS Leadership Summit, and you'll be able to find it in the Mind the Frontline video page here shortly. But essentially, it's talking about leadership and how they need to take ownership. And I like how you put that, because there's two ways I can frame it. Hey guys, here's the Mind the Frontline debrief hotline. If you need help, just reach out. Or hey, if you guys need to talk, I'm here for you. That's one way to approach it, versus, hey guys, sometimes on the job, things get a little overwhelming, they get a little stressful, and maybe we as a department have not set you guys up appropriately. We always try to, and if there's any way we could be doing things better, please let our staff know so we can continue to improve. However, I do recognize the importance of having as many resources as possible that are available to you. And here's this number, 866-MIND 24/7. I'm a big proponent of mental health, and I encourage all of our staff to use this when necessary. And it should, there's good resources, things like that. That sets it up and shows, even sharing their own personal experience with struggling. And that's where I really think we need to destigmatize and normalize these conversations. And it absolutely does start with senior leadership, mentors, those that are looked up to in that position, because they are what set the precedents for the generation before them, that are coming up. And being able to have those conversations and normalize it and go, hey guys, I have even struggled, and being transparent, because that's what these people want to hear. Like, they don't want to get lip service anymore. They want to hear, hey, you use this. Hey, chief believes in this, director believes in this, DC, whoever, BC, whoever your captain, in your command structure, whatever that looks like, if they believe in it, now you have buy-in, and it's just another barrier that you've removed as a leader that could inhibit people trying to get the help and the resources that they need. So I definitely loved how you brought that point together, but I do want to talk about, because I do think it's important. There's probably people out there right now that are struggling with, hey, I have that mental disconnect from what I saw versus what I'm now dealing with on media. And sometimes it doesn't go away.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. And I think the other thing, to think about is that you can't prepare yourself when this stuff's going to hit you. And I think that's why it's so important that we teach a lot of the recruits this resiliency process. Because I remember, there were times where I'd go to a call and the call would come in on dispatch. I'd read the note and I'd be like, man, this is going to be the worst thing ever. I'm going to be so messed up. And I'd get there and it would be fine. It'd be no problem. And then there's other times where a call will come in and be like, yeah, it's all good. And you walk in and you're like, from the minute that you open the door to the minute that you sit down, in your bed after shift, you're like, what just happened to me? And I remember one time specifically that was very eye-opening is, I had an individual that did some self-harm with an extension cord, and I did my call, no problem, whatever. And like months later, I was in Home Depot with my wife just picking up something for the house, and I saw the same exact extension cord for sale. And it just was like the whole thing hit me like a tidal wave, like the entire thing. And I couldn't even like talk for like 30 seconds. And I was like, what's going on? This call was months ago. I never had any symptoms of any stress of anything. So just, telling folks like when they get into this career, your mind's weird. It makes connections that are weird that you don't understand, and it can hit you even when you're not at work, even when you don't have your uniform on, even when you're on vacation. A song. I'm sure
Mhm.
everyone in the audience who works any dispatch system has had that episode where you're listening to music and you think you get dispatched because you hear the same note that your dispatch center uses. Your mind will do the same thing with trauma, and you just need to know that that can happen to you, because if you don't know that's coming, that's terrifying to have that happen to you and be like, what is going on with me? And so, a new member who knows that's a possibility, when that does happen, they go, oh, this sucks, but I know what's going on. I have an idea, and I can at least start to reach out and
Mhm.
get some help.
And communicate, more importantly. I like how you did that tie-in right there, because it does, like, it still happens to me. Like, I still get triggered based on if I'm driving by something, if I smell something, if a song comes on, if it'll be weird, because you're right, like, your mind plays tricks. Like, it could be a couple of people just, how they were walking or something like that, but that triggered a response or a previous call. And when you're in the middle of nowhere, like, if I was with my wife just shopping at Home Depot like you were, and we're just trying to get some stuff, and all of a sudden, you know, I'm brought back there, and it now you have the after effects of that, right? So you're hyper aroused, your autonomic, sympathetic nervous system is out of balance. And you're really trying to look at, how do I balance this out? And sometimes you don't, like, you're just like, okay, I remember the thought, and then you find yourself just after the fact, right? Being a little bit more aggressive, being a little bit more snippy, maybe being a little bit more reactive. Like, that's what I would find myself in. And sometimes I didn't realize I was even doing that. My wife would be like, are you okay? Like, did I do something wrong? No. And it had to take that wherewithal and that thought process to go, no, it's just my mind and now my body responding to this trigger. And so you're right, Nick. Like, if you're aware of it and go, okay, I'm triggered. And I've gotten a lot better about telling my wife when I'm triggered, so she's aware. So that way it's like, hey, this Chris isn't coming out of left field. Like, she understands it. And I do think the spouses of first responders just don't get enough credit, because they do want to help us. Their spouses or their significant others, they want to be there for them. They just don't know how. It's also like, for example, like, I went to a party with my friend's group, or my wife's friends group, this past weekend, and that big crowds, very triggering for me. Everybody's kind of, and so just little things like that, being able to communicate to your spouse. But because I have that awareness, and that's the most important part, right? Like, you have to know when something is happening to you, so then you can know how to respond to that situation. And then you can communicate what it is that you need to get through that situation. And don't forget the communication. Like, it's a step process, folks. So it's like, hey, first I recognize it. So sitting with it, identifying it, giving it a name. Okay, got it. Now the next thing is how do I get through this? Okay, maybe I need to go ground myself. Maybe I need to just go continue to walk around Home Depot. Or, hey, hey babe, I'm just going to go out to the car and hang out for just a minute and just go outside and get some fresh air. And then communicating like, hey, I just got triggered. I'm trying to work through it. Can you just, give me some space, or just give me a minute real quick? And just that, like, you get that support. Now your spouse is checked in with what's going on. You're checked in with yourself, more importantly, about what's going on. And now it's just the process of getting through it, right? And it's not scary if you know what you're doing and you have that armor.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think you're right on the money with that. Is if you don't communicate with, especially your spouse, let's just use that example. I mean, you're actively moving away from them. If you're being triggered and you're isolating and you're snapping at them and they don't understand what's going on, you look kind of like you're just being a dick, and they don't understand what's happening in your
Mm-hmm.
head. And if you don't communicate it, they're never going to know that. So you're actively moving away from each other. It's why the divorce rate is like insane in our career field, especially fire, military,
Yeah.
police. But if you do what you said and you communicate to your wife, hey, here's what's going on, they are now part of the team helping solve and care for you and give you what you need. And they're also more likely to ask for the same thing in return when they're going through something. And it may not be, first responder related. It might just be a stressful event. But when you open that line of communication, now instead of moving away from each other, you are on the same team working towards a goal of getting back to a place where you both feel good. And so that's like a huge connection. I kind of cheated and married an ER nurse, so she kind of has a lot of the same mentality as me, and we work in similar systems. We actually met when she was working on the ambulance, and so we were working together. So we kind of come from similar backgrounds. So I'm lucky in the way that I can communicate with her pretty well, and she can communicate with me. And I mean, she was just texting me this morning about a patient they had, and she knows I know, and I know she knows, and we can talk about it at dinner, and we're good about knowing where those limits are. Not everyone has that. You know, I have a lot of respect for folks that work in a high-paced career like this and are married to a banker or a lawyer or someone who works, in a job that's not related to first response, because you got to be careful about your secondary trauma. You can't just show up at home and start pouring out what you saw the way you saw it. And I think this is the main reason I wanted to be part of Mind the Frontline is your Mind Shield debrief hotline. That was such a huge, important resource for people. In my entire career, I had no resources, or I had resources if you were about to commit suicide. There was nothing in between. It was, if you're going to harm yourself, call this number. If you're dealing with, drug or alcohol abuse, call this number. And then, but everything else, like until you get to that point, like if you're not addicted to drugs or alcohol or about to, harm yourself, don't worry about it. You're fine. And I think you have such an
apparently
important
it's that
niche
famous thing, like you're fine.
Yeah, right. And so I think like having this debrief hotline, when you explained what it was like, man, I need to be part of this, because that's what I needed over the last like 14 years. I didn't need a crisis line. I didn't need alcohol, or substance treatment. Just with my personal experience, what I did need is someone like me or like you that's willing to answer the phone and go, hey, sounds like you're in Home Depot and you just had an experience where you just got a little bit rocked. Have you heard of moral injury? Oh, you haven't? Let's talk about that for a second. Have you read this book? Like someone that has that, I forget what they call it, when you use like psychedelics and they have a guide for you that helps you like stay out of negative territory. But, this guide to help you, work through these problems if you never got that training. Because a lot of us in this field, we didn't get that. We're behind the eight ball. So who do we call when we do feel those emotions? And the debrief hotline is such an important resource. I'm really proud that you're doing that.
Well, thanks. And thank you for being on the team and helping out and answering those calls. But that was kind of the reason behind the founding of it, because for me, same thing. It's like, unless you were in crisis and having a really bad day, everything is fine. No, it was so far from the truth. And these things build up over time. We know that. So once again, an ounce of prevention could be a pound of cure. So giving, first responders the opportunity to call, a phone number or text now, because we just got approved from that through the FCC. So awesome. You guys can now text us at Mind 24/7. But at the same time, it gives people an opportunity, because like you mentioned, like we bring this home and we have secondary trauma, right? We could put secondary trauma on our spouses without even knowing that. And that's the whole point of the debrief hotline. It's not, we're not a crisis hotline. That's coming soon. But more importantly, it's an ability that, okay, I just experienced a moral injury, or I just got triggered and I don't know what to do, right? It's, hey, I got to reach out. I need a mental health sponsor or a mental health coach or mentor, however you want to look at that. That's really who you're calling. We've looked at other ways on how to call this program, and it's kind of hard, right? Because yeah, it really is peer support, but it's also like mental health coaching for first responders, because we're also hopefully giving and instilling some of these tools that we've learned through the training that we've done, on how to address some of these moral injuries, what you can do to help navigate this, how to communicate and create a support group, because we know that having a support system, especially because that's what we do. Like we isolate, we're turned into dicks, and then our wives want to leave us because now we're doing other things. And it's not those things that, it could be the trash not getting taken out, or someone didn't put this away. That's what I found myself doing. That was me. I was the dick. And what I had to do is recognize, like, when I'm being a dick now, and even my wife now will call me out on it. Luckily, she's in the medical field too. So there is a little bit of, there's still boundaries there, but, she understands it. But being able to say, hey, I don't want to isolate myself anymore, because that just continues the trauma. That just continues to isolate you, and you get in your head, and you start spiraling out of control. So if you're able to bring in the support system and looking at the importance of support networks for first responders, it's crucial. And that's kind of why we created, Mind the Frontline in general. Like, it is a support system and a community for everybody. But we need to have that way, whether it's Mind the Frontline or you have your own friend group or your own buddies that you hang out with after work that you can really lean on, because this job does take it out on you. It does provide a lot of additional psychological effects and job related stressors, and having that strong social support system and that network and getting that formed now, not when you're in crisis, because when you're in crisis, you don't know what to do. It takes these individuals to really recognize it in you and say, hey, are you okay? We had one of our own community members, one of the own volunteers, checked in on me this weekend because he got a vibe that, hey, seems like you might be struggling a little bit, because guess what? I'm not I'm not immune to it. I struggle just like everybody else. And so it does work. But once again, it was very impressed. I was very humbled and honored, because you can see the system working. More importantly, you can see that, hey, by creating this community, people pick up on little things, and they are active, not reactive. They're active. And that's what we're stressing. Be active, folks. So having some of these support groups ahead of time and getting those formed before you get in crisis is extremely important. It's just as important as getting, a mental health professional or a therapist or a psychologist, whoever you feel like you want to talk to that is a mental health professional, and having that on hand and starting that before you actually need it, because there's going to come times where life just gets hard. You had a bad call, you had a stressful shift, you're dealing with that dick boss who's also stressed, basically struggling as well, silently. You're gonna need someone to help and reach out to and ask. And the cool thing is by asking for help and saying, and seeing some of these things work, it gets easier every time. So the next time it becomes easier to ask for help or talk to your spouse and say, hey, I'm really triggered. I'd much rather tell my wife that I'm triggered than do some of the other emotions that come out, like, aggressiveness and reactiveness and being a dick. And then she gets mad at me for that and thinks I'm just a horrible human, versus now she can go, hey, I understand why is he's struggling, and I'm here to support that. And so she doesn't take it as critical on herself or as serious, and she can help me, navigate some of these things. But, when you look at the Journal of Occupational Health and Psychology, they found that social support from colleagues and supervisors was associated with lower levels of emotional exhaustion. So once again, getting leadership involved, they got to start having these conversations.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think a really important point about the debrief hotline is just reminding folks that you might not have a great system where you are, but this is a system where you can just pick up the phone. It's separate and independent from your workplace, which is huge, right? If you're my chief and you're also on the peer team and I talk to you about like how I'm not feeling good and how I'm like, they say it's separate, but there's always that part of you that's like you put on a different hat, but we're still in your office. Like, is this going to come back around? Are you going to like refer me to EAP without talking to me? And now they're going to pull me off the truck and put me in training till I feel better, right? Like, we don't want any of that. Sometimes you just want to talk about a call and just have it be over. And I think a really important thing that I learned later than later than I wish I did was not feeling this pressure to fix everything and fix people. There was so many times where I would see someone struggling and I'd try to like intervene and figure out what to do and how to like make them feel better. And here's what I'm seeing and here's what I'm doing. And it didn't always go well. And then I was talking to a mental health clinician and they were talking about this concept of taking space. And I had a really good friend who was going through a really big crisis. He ended up being coming off the job for a couple of weeks and he wasn't around the firehouse and no one really saw him. So I went over to his house and I was hanging out with him and I was like, you know what, I'm going to try something new. And I didn't talk about anything. He's in there. He's kind of like, you can tell he's a little sheepish because of what's going on. And, he's lost his identity because he was a high ranking member and now he's at home and everyone knows that he's not at work and it's a whole thing. And so I show up and I'm like, hey, you still need to do that roofing project? And he goes, yeah. I'm like, all right, get your jeans on. We're going to go take care of this roof. And we just went up and we just sat on his roof and just put a roof cap on for an hour. We didn't talk about anything mental health related. We didn't talk about any stress. I didn't talk about work, nothing. We just sat there in a summer day and just did the roof cap. And then after an hour, he just set the tool down and was like, man, I'm not doing good. And I was like, I know. What do you need? And like that space, allowing that person to not have to be like cornered into talking about what's going on and just come to you when they're ready and know that you're there to support them. And if he hadn't brought it up, I would have packed up the tools, got in my truck and left and come back the next week, no problem. Right? Just letting them come to you has been such a difference. Even with my wife, if she's going through something, not, forcing my way in there to try to talk and fix it and meddle and tweak, just I'm here for you. What do you need? If you need anything, I'm around. And just being available has been such a game changer.
Well, we are fixers, right? Like I did. It's funny. It seems like our stories are just on repeat, but I found myself doing the same thing because when you don't know and you haven't gone through formal peer support training and learning, like you can only do what you feel like is good intentions, right? And sometimes I would try fixing other people because I didn't want to fix myself, And so once again, like
Oh yeah.
I'll help my patients, I'll help everybody else, but I won't take care of myself. I won't help myself. But I like how you put that by having and just creating an opportunity really is all you did. You created an opportunity for that safe space to occur. And then when he felt ready or she, I don't know which one you're alluding to, but when they feel ready, they're able to come to you. It's kind of like, if anybody's watched Hitch, it's like, hey, we come a certain distance and, for some people there's different boundaries. It could be 90%, let them come 10. It could be, hey, you go 40, let them come 60. But really we should be on the lower end of that. We should let them come the 90 and we just kind of guide them through that last kind of 10% because, I also like to kind of commend you because I think this is another thing about what we're trying to push right now, right, Nick? It's being proactive. If you see someone that might be struggling and just not know, first off, find some good resources. There's definitely some good resources out there. We do have some blogs that we talk about some of these things and how to have some of these discussions. And we do webinars, just to educate people on, hey, what to say, what not to say. And just those are good ways to get tools. But the same type, like you recognize someone that was struggling and you took an active response to that just by, hey, I'm just going to come check in. And you didn't sit there and immediately go after like in a fixing mode. You went just hey, I just don't want you to be alone. It sucks when you're isolated. And I, so if you're able just to kind of sit with them in that silence and allow them to kind of warm up to that safe place and then be able to share. And I like how you did it. Like you went out and did an activity. And I think that is kind of important. If you have the ability to go for a walk, do a project, do something, get outdoors, go camping, go shooting, go fishing, try to make a little hobby out of it. And if you can't, that's fine. Just hang out, play cards or just watch TV. And when they feel ready, because you got to remember, like I remember this when I was really, really struggling is you want to talk to someone. You just don't trust anyone. And that is the sheer fact of this. And this is why, having that layer of anonymity, you're right. Like, hey, we don't talk to anybody's employers. This is all in house, very protected. And we want that because we want people and understand that people fear of being safe and vulnerable is really, really hard. It's not as hard as asking for help. So those are the two things that we have facing these individuals that just don't want to share or get it off their chest. So we have to look at creative ways that we can kind of put some camouflage on, so to speak, and approach it in a new way, which it sounds like you did. And that worked out really well, and whether that first responder shared with you or not, as someone who has been there, I'm sure he felt a little bit better and a little bit more weight off because knowing he had somebody in his corner, someone he could confide in, and he wasn't feeling as alone as he was before he showed up.
Yeah, I think the big piece there is, that person is feeling so helpless in that environment, like they've lost their identity, they're not going to work, and they're kind of in this spiral of like, I can't do what I was meant to do. I'm not good enough. Like all this negative self-talk that's pouring in. So having a friend show up and not talk about that, and the level 201 is like, hey, can you help me? I have a project I need your help on. I need you to help me with my roof, right? Because now that's the first time probably in a few weeks where someone said, I need you to help me. And that's so opposite of what everyone's been thinking. I remember, my wife was going through some stuff, and one time she was like, why you keep trying to help me? Like you're better than me. Like you're coming to save me from myself. Like you're not better than me. Like, and I thought about that. I'm like, man, that's a really good point. Like she's a grown adult. She's a tough lady. I mean, she's the toughest lady I know. She doesn't need me to come in there and save her. And I think sometimes we feel that that's our job because that's what our career is. But in reality, like they might just want to be treated normal for one day so they can just feel normal for a minute, and then they go from this negative spiral to this positive spiral, like, man, that day felt good, I got outside, I'll get outside tomorrow. And I think just sometimes just going in and not talking about the elephant in the room right away, just dealing with the human being and saying, hey, I'm your friend, let's go for a walk, let's go fishing, I love fishing, and just enjoy being around them is like so above and beyond any sort of like counseling or referrals or anything we could do. Just get them so their sympathetic nervous system goes away for a second, just to give them a break from themselves. Everything else will come in time.
And really, that's what they need. They just need a break from themselves. And so when you show up and you are providing that safe space and allowing them to just feel safe, like that safety, it's like, if you're a wildland firefighter, you always want to fight from the black, right? So same mentality here, like fight from the black. Let them kind of walk in because they're in the fire right now. They're on the fire line. We want them to kind of come into the black where they feel safe. And now we can get them rehabbed. Now we can start, okay, where do we go from here? And you could provide that guidance. Just don't try to force it on people, because same thing, Nick, like I've tried to do that. And like, hey, if you just do this, you're going to be great. What I have found is like, really nobody wants to hear that. Like when they're drowning, you're like, hey, if you just would have went to swim lessons, you'd feel better. Right.
Yeah.
It's more or less like, hey, I get that you're in the shit. I've been in the shit and it really sucks to be alone. And I don't want you to be alone. So, would it be all right if next weekend, you come over and we go do something? We go bowling, we go mini golfing, we go hit a bucket of balls. Like, hey, let's just do that. Because one, now you're saying like, hey, I'm not here to be your hero, because there's always that complex that we deal with. But you're also saying like, hey, I'm giving this individual something to look forward to next, right? You got them in a nice safe space. You've been able to get them to confide in you. But now, like you mentioned, you're feeling still alone. And so, hey, how about in 2 days we go hit a bucket of balls? And don't give them like an option, or, try to be a little bit loose with it. But, hey, here's a day, here's a time, here's a location, right? And that way it once again kind of starts hopefully breaking down some of those mental challenges, because they're probably, their thought in their head is like, yeah, sure, but they're going to go back to isolating. So being able to kind of set that commitment up while they're kind of feeling good, and then they start associating with like, okay, as I hang out with Nick, I'm able to have safe conversations if I want to have them, and if not, I'm still a guy. I'm still Nick's friend, and we're just doing Nick's friend stuff.
Yeah, just don't treat them differently just because they're going through something. Like I'm sure, when you're going through anything, and I know when I was going through something, if you have something going on and people are like, "Hey, Chris, buddy, how you doing, man? You okay?" Like it makes you feel so bad about yourself and so weird. It doesn't even feel like yourself. But if I'm like, "Hey, Chris, what's happening, man? You want to go fly fishing this weekend? Like I'd really appreciate your help. I don't have someone to run the back of the canoe for me. I need someone to paddle for me." Like now I'm just treating you like a human being. Your experience of trauma is not becoming you. You're just Chris who has something going on. You're not the trauma. You're just Chris who has something going on. And I think that's really important to touch on. And they don't always need your help. Sometimes they just need your support. You just need to say, hey, I'm available for you if you need anything. Let's go do this together. Let's take some space. Let's go have a coffee, and we'll just look out the window and count cars or whatever. Like you're still my friend, and I'm going to be here. And I don't need to come in and solve all your problems for you. You're a grown adult. Like I'm here if you need something. And that's paid dividends to me, just approaching it that way and saying, I'm available. I'm available. If you need me, I got a brain and you know how it works, and I'm happy to contribute, but I'm not going to be here trying to solve your problems for you.
That's a good way to approach it, man. Some really good techniques and tips there, I think, for everybody listening and watching this episode. And it's great because I'm sure there's a lot of people that had that very question, when they came into this episode. And so being able to, how to have these hard conversations, because death and dying just aren't going away, especially if you're in the first responder field. It's something that we need to learn how to, grieve, learn how to process. But going back to kind of what you said at the beginning of the show, is building that resilience in that emergency kind of response, building the resilience to look at what is essential, right? So when you look at, first responders being able to maintain, a well-being, keep their composure, right? While they're on scene, because nobody's expecting you just to be able to break down, right? Like, we still need to show up and do our jobs, but we still need to be able to have that resilience when we walk in. Once again, you're putting that mental armor on and walking out on the battlefield. You're not going out there naked. You're going out there kind of prepared with some expectations, some ideas, and more importantly, some tools on how to self-recover. Because you're right. Sometimes people don't want you to come in and fix their problem. They just want you to be with them so they're not alone. Sometimes they just want to have a conversation so they feel normal, because everybody else is basically treating them like they're broken or they're damaged. Because those were some of the mental thoughts and the emotions I struggled with. And we look at research, and it suggests that, like, when you're resilient, and you're cultivated, through some of these various techniques, meaning that you practice them in your techniques, you practice them in your daily life. And this is why I think when you say, Nick, that mental health and wellness is a daily thing. It really is. Like, if you guys want to have this resiliency, it doesn't just come in and come to you over a short period of time. It's something you have to build yourself up with, but you got to start now. It's not something you could do once a week or once a quarter and think that you're going to get into a challenging situation and feel like you have your battlefield armor on, because, as you mentioned, Home Depot, you got triggered. It comes whenever. The battlefield can be 24/7 for some people. And so by having some of this resiliency and being able to include, like, mindfulness practices, cognitive behavioral therapy, talking to a mental health professional, stress management, talking about that. Emotional intelligence is another really good discussion topic. Talking about anger, talking about fear. I wish we would talk more about some of these emotions, as we're doing shift change or as part of our, daily train when we're on the job, because I do think by normalizing what we call fear, normalizing what we call stress, normalizing what we call anger, it does make people self-aware, and it gives them more resiliency tools. And discussing these resiliency building strategies and their effectiveness, obviously, especially when it's coming from a leadership level, it definitely empowers, those frontline staff to really start, hey, maybe I should check in myself. And then it just becomes a thing. It's kind of like Billy Madison, if everybody's peeing their pants, it's cool. And we're just trying to make peeing your pants cool. Mental health is cool. So let's see if we can get everybody to jump on that bandwagon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's very much a version of stress inoculation, or at least the initial recruit academies. If there's a lot of research that shows if you receive too much stimulus too quickly and you underperform, your performance thereafter is actually worse than if you had done no training at all. Right. So if you go to a critical care prep program and all of a sudden you just give them a malfunctioning balloon pump and they flounder and fail, and then they go to the exam, they'd actually do worse than if they had no experience with your program. And so what we do in these recruit academies is expose them to frustration, stress, anger, sadness, loss, betrayal, like all these other emotions that we can encounter in our field. And then we do it in small little settings, and we coach them through the process and give them a skill set. And then we ramp up the stimulus to the point where after 16 weeks, they're doing this big, huge multi-company, 2 ladders, 3 engines, 4 floors, fires in 2 locations, 5 victim, like simulated scenario where now they're able to apply the skills they learned, right? If they get disoriented, they have that skill set of, okay, I'm feeling fear. Check. Okay, I got disoriented. Okay, I've been in this building 100 times in the last 16 weeks. I'm going to find a wall. Like, they have a process to work through on their own. And a good barometer that I've always found with mental health is apply whatever you're dealing with mental health to physical health. So if someone in your agency broke their wrist, how would you treat them? Right? What would they be doing around the agency? How would they be utilized? What type of resources would they access? Would they just stick their wrist in ice and then try to go back to work the next day? No, that makes no sense. Even every employee from the top down would be like, that makes no sense. You need to go to the doctor. You need to get some treatment. You might need to be put on a little medicine. You might need to do a PT exercise. You might need to, be around the station and do something different for a little bit, but that's still your friend. It's still your friend. It's just your friend with a broken wrist. So why can't we correlate the way we treat physical injuries to the same way we treat mental health injuries? It's like, because you have a mental health injury, you like stop becoming Chris, and I'm just going to like avoid you because I don't know what to do with you. If you broke your arm, you'd still be my buddy. You'd just be Chris with a broken arm, until that heals. And I think that's always treated me really well, is like, I think of, if this were a physical injury, what type of resources would be available and what would this person's recovery look like? And it should be somewhat mimicked. The brain is a muscle, just like anything else, and we need to think about it that way, I think.
Maybe it has something to do with that mental disconnect, right? Like when you see someone with a physical injury, you're like, I get it. Like your brain kind of like makes that connection. You get it. And I think growing up, more importantly, like think about when you were a kid. Oh, hey, Billy over here broke his arm. Okay, like you see how people treat Billy. You see a cast. Okay, this is normal, right? But we don't talk about these discussions with our kids. Like I do at my house now because I see the relevancy and the importance of informing my children on emotional awareness and some of these things. And, you know, you can't see what's up here. You can see what's going to break something out here. And I like how you put that. I've always been a big advocate is you should treat this like any on the job injury, whether it be, hey, they had a heart attack on the job, they broke their ankle on the job, they had a sprain, they inhaled smoke. Like when you have someone that's inhaled smoke, like you don't sit there and, even though they have no physical injury, like you don't give them a hard time. Like you go, oh, okay, like you're injured. I get it. You probably need to go to this and that. So I do think it's just a shift in culture and mentality and the train of thought of thinking of how we're trying to now address some of these things. And really the only way to kind of get to that point is continuing to normalize the conversation. So I like how you put that, like treat them like they were no different. Like and what would you would expect for someone that would have a on the job work injury? Well, I would expect them that they probably went into the ER or saw some sort of acute treatment, right? And then from there, it's going to take some follow-up treatment. And then we're probably going to need some medicine to manage the symptoms, right? Not to say pain or swelling, you just say manage the symptoms, right? Maybe it's an SSRI, maybe it's a sleep med, maybe it's an anti-anxiety and antipsychotic. Like I've been in all of them. Trust me, it's and it just gets okay. I think, going back to what I started with is why do we feel like this is just not a normal conversation and we can't treat someone, I can't treat Chris with a broken arm or, injured brain, injured, moral injury. I can't treat him like I would Carl over here with a broken fracture. I think it is a little bit of fear, right? They just don't know how to have these conversations, and everybody like treats everybody like they're so fragile that if they even talk to them, they're going to break. And more importantly, it's the not talking to them because you are just by your inability and the silence treating them effectively different than Carl. So Nick, who's suffering from a moral injury, if we're treating the same way and I'm approaching him the same way, I'm having conversations the same way, they don't have fear. So I do think fear for those who may not have the tools yet, hopefully they'll find them through these podcasts and through Mind the Frontline. But mainly, getting those tools on how you can have these conversations and educate yourself, right? Like just like you and I learned coming into this, like when we started wanting to help people and just do it intrinsically, well, at least we were doing something, but may not have always had the best outcome. So now we have learned and now taken what we have learned and are now applying them to updated situations in our current practice. And we're seeing better results. And that's just, you have to be okay. It's just like when you learn a new skill or procedure or medical procedure, you're going to make a mistake and it's okay, but you got to try to do something versus just sitting there in the background and be silent and be like, hey, we don't want to touch Carl, or sorry, we don't want to touch Nick because, I feel like if I say anything to Nick, like it might throw him over the edge or maybe he'll go, hurt himself, and that's the fear that drives people and they just don't know how to handle that. So that's once again, I don't think we got that as a kid. Like, I don't remember my parents ever saying like, oh, so-and-so's really depressed and they're going through this. And this is some of the things that people go through when they're depressed. Nobody educated me in that way. So I didn't know how to react to that. But, once again, I'm trying to change my parenting style with my kids and go, oh, so-and-so's a little off. They're a little bit depressed. Depressive means this. So these are kind of some of the feelings you might feel. And that's okay. So that way I can start normalizing it for my kids and bring that self-awareness into my own house.
Yeah, that's so great. I think that's important. I mean, I have a young daughter, so I'm trying to figure out exactly how we're going to navigate this crazy world that we're in and give her the tools she needs to be, successful. And I think this is really where the Mind the Frontline debrief hotline can come into play for a lot of folks, is if you know that there's something going on, but you don't know what to do, we can help as peer support team members, give them the number. You don't need to solve the problem. Just try to get them, to access some resources. Hey, have you thought about calling these folks? It's totally anonymous. Guest. He lives in Vermont. He might answer. He's like, you can just chat with him about whatever. Nothing's recorded. We're not going to submit anything to your state government. We're just here to be available. And I always think of it as the strength of a good peer team isn't, we're not going to go in and read all the books in the library for you and tell you what they say, but we're going to be like the librarian, where we know where the different categories are. We know where the different sections of the library are. And we might say, hey, Chris, have you heard, The Body Keeps the Score? Have you read that book? I read that one. That was pretty interesting. It talks a lot about biochemistry. Do you like medical chemistry? That might be interesting, right? I'm not going to tell them what the book says, but I'm going to help encourage them. Do you like podcasts? Oh, have you listened to this? Have you ever heard of EMDR? I can help find an EMDR counselor in your area for you. Here's what it's like. I've been through EMDR and I found it's really helpful. This is my experience. What about ketamine therapy? We're the librarians who can direct folks to different resources. We're not going to give them the answers. Just like a good therapist is not going to tell you what's wrong with you. They know within 3 minutes of you being in that room on that couch what's going on with you. But the whole point is to give you the ownership and let you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and find your own solution, because it's so much more powerful to have that self-discovery. And so if you're someone that's in an agency and you don't have a peer support program, you don't have a mental health culture, maybe your chief isn't a buy-in guy or a buy-in girl, and you don't know what to do, just show them the Mind the Debrief hotline. Just give them that number, 1-866-MIND-247. It's free. It's available. Somebody from the peer support team will pick up that phone, and we can take that step, and we can bring in some experience and some knowledge. And also, like you said, there might be times where we answer the phone and we go, you know what, this is kind of above my pay grade. And we can say, hey, I'm gonna help you the best I can, and now I'm gonna hand you off to a crisis counselor, or I'm gonna hand you off to Safe Call Now, or I'm gonna get you into some EMDR as best we can. We're gonna work on that for you, because it sounds like this is something that you would really appreciate doing, and we can be that resource. So sometimes just making the connection is the best thing you can do, besides taking space and being there with them.
Yeah, and those that don't know what to do, like they see someone struggling, they want to say something, but not sure what to say or what the right first step is. Same applies to them. We've had some of those calls on the peer support hotline, the debrief hotline, where essentially it's like, hey, I got this buddy, they're really struggling. I'm not sure what to do. Like, what are some things I can do? And obviously we try to do that through blogs and podcasts and everything else that we try to put out there as Mind the Frontline. But at the end of the day, it's a resource to be utilized for everybody. You don't have to be in crisis. You don't have to be struggling. You could just be struggling with trying to figure out, like, how do I talk to somebody who's struggling, or how do I approach them, or what can I do to best support them? And if you need to call and talk to someone, I'd much rather you do that, right? And at the same time, guess what? Like, you're leveling up yourself, I'm sure, because those words of wisdom, hopefully, that come across the other end, are going to give you tools for the day that you walk into that landmine. But at the same time, it gives you that courage and leads the way of, okay, like, now I've talked to somebody. And sometimes that's all it is. Like, once again, fear, right? So if I don't have the fear anymore of, okay, now I got a little bit of knowledge and I know how to, approach this and create a safe space and not really talk about the elephant in the room, and really let them come to me, and really just just saying, like, hey, giving them opportunities to be helpful for others. Because once again, that's a crisis identity at the same time of, I don't want to say that I can't take care of myself, but really I can't take care of myself. And so, and being open, so those are all tools that you guys can get. But when it comes to death and dying, I think it's having these conversations, Nick, and because we know these are the feelings that kind of come out of it. And we know there's some of the struggles, and some of them is probably struggling right now listening to this. And so if you are, know that you're not alone. And it's normal to kind of feel these emotions and feelings after dealing and watching a human being pass and transition into the next life, wherever that might be. Whether you believe in religion or politics or whatever, like, it doesn't really change the face of what trauma is and moral injury. At the end of the day, moral injury is moral injury, and it's human to feel these normal, these emotions. It's just you haven't been provided with the tools to recognize it sometimes, or even how to react to it. And so don't suffer by yourself in silence. Don't isolate. These are the things that you do want to try to get a support group. And it's all about pre-planning. Honestly, if you're not there and you're not struggling, that's great. Like, that means you're doing something right, hopefully. But consider working on your mental health and wellness every day, and consider, getting a mental health professional that you see on a regular basis. And consider just going through some peer support training at the same time, because why not? There's always ways that we can better ourselves. And more importantly, it's just like you got called to medicine, Nick. It's just like I did. I enjoyed critical care medicine. I enjoyed medicine in general, aviation medicine. And then I kind of got a bug under the mental health because it happened to me. And I realized how broken the system was, and the resources were sparse and they were fragmented, and nobody wanted to talk to me because they didn't know how to talk to me. And at the time, in the moment, like, you're angry at these individuals. You're like, I thought you guys were my coworkers. I thought you guys were my friends, and you didn't even show up. And it's not that they didn't want to show up. They just didn't know how to show up. And so they thought by not showing up was actually safer than doing something that might have caused you more harm. So it's not that they didn't care about you. They did. They cared about you so great that they decided to go against whatever instinct they had to reach out, and because they were fearful that they might cause more injury. And so it's also looking at that. Now, could you hear that in the moment of the crisis? Probably not, man. That noise is fairly loud. But if you're past the storm right now, or you're about ready, or maybe you never know, you're just always preparing to go into a storm. Just having that wherewithal and being able to have these conversations and break it down, and treat people like they know, nothing's changed. Because it is, when you watch someone transition, then you see it on the news later, or it doesn't go away, and you start having intrusive thoughts, like, it gets to you. And you have to you have to have a way to unpack that. You have to have a way to talk about it and create that safe space, whether you create in your own household with you and your spouse, or once again, it starts with me and my spouse, because she's with me all the time. And then from there, it balloons out as needed. And sometimes I can't see it myself. And so, because I've created this peer support network of good friends and good coworkers and just good brothers and sisters, they take care of me too when I can't see it in myself, and kind of help me. And sometimes that's what I need, because you're like, I didn't see it, because it's very insipidous. I call it insipidous for a reason, because it shows up at Home Depot. It shows up when I'm at McDonald's. It shows up when I'm swimming laps. It shows up when I'm working out. It just shows up and sneaks its rear, ugly little head in there. And sometimes I can catch it, and I'm I can deal with it and work through it. And sometimes I can't, new camouflage, it adapts, I don't know what you want to call it, but it does get better.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's the thing, is it's not going to stay at work. There's a lot of folks that I worked with who dealt with some significant trauma, and, putting their uniform, the turnout gear back in the locker was the way that tried to isolate it. And I'm like, it's gonna find you. It's gonna find you somehow. It's gonna find you in your insomnia. It's gonna find you in your drinking. It's gonna find you in your depression, maybe your lack of motivation. You're gonna stop exercising. Your family interactions, your crew interactions. In that the blog post we talked about, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, is about me going through some of my ambulance years, and then getting to a place where you're like, man, am I Mr. Hyde? Like, what's going on here? And then, like, one of the things we talk about in brief every single shift at the helicopter is what to do in an inadvertent meteorological conditions. And it's like, if you don't know what's going on, start a climb, turn only to avoid known obstacles, contact center, engage the autopilot, get yourself vectored to VFR or an instrument approach. Like, there's there's procedure if you get yourself in trouble in the helicopter that all the pilots know, all the air crew knows. We recite it every day. I'm like, man, what if we had that for mental health, like an inadvertent IMC procedure for mental health? And that's somewhat of what, like, the Mind the Frontline debrief hotline is to a certain degree. It's like that ability to okay, I'm in the clouds and I don't know where I am. Give me a call. And it's like, okay, can you see anything? I got you on radar. Like, we are able to provide some of that support. And I think that's really important to remember, that you're not alone and you do have support. And if you're not getting it at your agency, or your agency's behind the times, or they're working on it, the debrief hotline is a great way to do that. And for a long time, in all transparency, I really had a hard time with peer support programs because there were some agencies that I worked for that utilized them. And it basically was like, these 3 people are peer support members and they'll solve all the problems. And I'm like, yeah, but I work with those people and I may have a checkered past with them. I may not get along with them. I may not jive very well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, why are there only 3 out of 100 people that I can talk to? And then like it turned into this thing where if you had a bad day, someone would tell the peer team that you were having a bad day and they would come find you and be like, I hear you're having and it was like the narc squad. And I was like, this isn't. So I really got turned off to peer team for a long time. And then I met you and Amy and Brett. Yeah. And I started talking about it a lot more. And my big sticking point was like, why do we have a peer team of 3 people? Shouldn't we all be peer team? Like, shouldn't we all be able to, like, shouldn't I be able to talk to any crew member about anything, anytime? Like, isn't that the purpose of a good organization? And the way that Brett and Amy kind of described it, which I really appreciated, is think of it like a tiered response system in 911. Like, not everyone's a paramedic, but everybody knows how to stop the bleeding, right? So everyone on the crew, everyone in the agency should have some basic fundamental, okay, this person's in crisis or this person's struggling. I can work with you and talk with you and help you a little bit. But if it gets really bad, we need a paramedic intercept. We need a peer support member that has that better training, that depth of knowledge, the bigger connections, the Mind the Debrief hotline where we have access to Safe Call Now, 988, EMDR, Tanya Glenn, Chris Metana. Like, we have all these resources available. And then if it gets really bad, maybe we need a physician, maybe we need Tanya, or maybe we need a mental health professional. And just identifying that, not everyone has to be all 3. Sometimes people just need a check-in. They just need, hey, you want to go fly fishing? All right, cool. Let's decompress a little bit. And maybe that's something we all do together. Sometimes I might need a little more of like, I need some help finding an AA meeting. Okay, let's get you to the peer support team. There's specialists in that. They can help you with that. And sometimes it's like, you know what? This is a very precarious situation. This really needs some serious intervention. We're going to include the community members and the peer support team, but we're also going to include a clinician because we want to make sure that acute stress reaction doesn't develop into that post-traumatic stress disorder because it goes unchecked. So I think they really helped me fall back in love with peer support because I had some bad experiences in my life, and I appreciate how you and Amy and Brett have kind of approached it, and I'm back on board and I'm loving it. And I really thank you for your time and energy you put into building it the right way.
Well, thank you, Nick. That does mean a lot, man. And I got to give my hats off to both Amy and Brett, our director of peer support, Amy Wright, and our assistant director, Brett Zigarelli, of peer support, because that's who's really pushing this, along with the support of the volunteers that we have a part of the peer support team. And it's really just approaching it from a different concept. It doesn't seem so difficult, right? It seems very easy when you put it in concept, but in practice, as you're seeing, Nick, it does take a lot of effort and a lot of work because we got to change culture. We got to change train of thought. We got to at least try to inform that 27-year-old veteran, that, hey, 27-year career veteran that's like, hey, you can't teach me anything new. Like, okay, maybe I can't teach you a complete, like, I'm not going to bring a whole new, enlightening thing, but if I could get you to maybe do these 3 things, and I like how you put like the introvert and IIMC. So someone's been definitely studying for their FPC exam, but yeah, like if we have an IIMC event, what can we do? Like if I could just remember these 3 things in crisis, or teach other people 3 things in crisis on what to do. And I like that, hey, just try to stay steady as you go, right? Steady as you go, so you're not hitting into any other obstacles. That means drop the bottle if you're drinking, go home, get to a safe place, like steady as she goes. And then the next part, and this is obviously some good discussion. I want to see where it goes, when we bring it back to the team. But the next part is communicate, ask for help. Here are the resources to communicate, whether it's within your own department, your own agency or regional resources, or reaching out to a third party, 501c3 nonprofit like Mind the Frontline, where it's like, hey, these are people that get me. They're culturally competent. They understand. They've walked that line. They understand. And then basically navigate, and we'll help you with that navigation part, right? So if you can just continue to fly straight and not hurt yourself or others, right? Then you could communicate with somebody, and then they can help guide you to those resources that you need to get you out of that storm. And that sounds simple. But I can tell you the recognition that you're in a storm to begin with is hard. The communication piece, even harder, very difficult. Even I struggle with that still, of going, yeah, I need help. And sometimes it takes someone else coming to me in a productive way and doing it the right way, like the way that Eddie did it for me yesterday. He was like, hey man, just wanted, he texted me about something totally random. It was about the memorial run that we have coming up in April with the Airvac team out there in Oklahoma. And he's like, yeah, hey, kind of just talked about that. And he's like, kind of just put it out there. Like, last line was, how's your headspace? And it took me, I hesitated with that text to even reply to it, and really opening up and being vulnerable and transparent. And I was like, it took me honestly the next day to go like, hey, yeah, man, like I'm a little overwhelmed right now. I'm a little stressed out, but it's getting easier, right? But you have to practice this. Even me, the founder of Mind the Frontline, I still struggle with this, folks. Like I said, this is why it's so important to me, because if we don't start doing this, and if I'm not practicing or the team's not practicing what we preach, then really it is snake oil. But we're doing this. Like, we are practicing it, and we're forcing ourselves to do it, because there really is no other way to change the culture that's been so ingrained into public safety across all the lines, unless we really start making some of these changes. And it starts with ourselves. And so hopefully we can give others the tools to get out of crisis. And I kind of like that, hey, don't hurt yourself, stay safe, communicate, and then we'll help you navigate. At that point, that's pretty cool. Nice job, Nick. Look at you. See?
Yeah.
Great idea.
We're doing it. Yeah. No, it's pretty cool. There's I remember going to EMS World Expo. I love the trauma symposium they do it's like my favorite, because I love trauma. And the doctor who runs the PJs out of Long Island, I forget his name, he runs the PJ Med podcast. He was talking about
Dr.
triage,
Rush.
and he was saying how, Dr. Rush, he was saying about how all these PJs are doing all these trauma things. They're doing all these interviews with people who are from like Beirut and all these big events. And the feedback is, I can remember 3 things under stress. That's it. I'm not going to remember the triage guidelines. I'm not going to remember Jumpstart. I'm not going to remember any of those pieces. It's too much. I'm going to remember 3 things. You get 3, so make them good. And I thought that was really impactful. And like you're mentioning, my buddy's a pilot for the Army, and I did a podcast with him a couple years ago, and we were talking about Sully Sullenberger landing on the Hudson. And one of the things he kept emphasizing is that from the first week you're in flight school all the way to the end of your flying career, they always, impart on you this aviate, navigate, communicate. It's like, you need to level the wings. Like, if there's an emergency, don't crash the plane because there's a blinking dash light. We've seen that happen. Aviate, navigate, communicate. And the same thing could be true for mental health. Like you said, I mean, are you in a safe place? There's been people that I've worked with, both them having mental health emergencies, or times when I've been having a tough time. And one of the first questions a lot of people ask is like, are you safe right now? Like, are you in crisis, right? Aviate, level the wings, get yourself stable. And if you're not stable, we need to address that. If your engines are on fire, we need to start getting that under control and get you to a place where you can be safe. And that may be all we do, is that first step. It's getting you to 988 or getting you to help or whatever. Navigate, like, okay, what's going on? What do you notice about yourself? What's happening? What are you feeling? Just gathering that information and trying to figure out, where in space are you? Like, what's going on with that? And then, like you said, I mean, that 201 level intervention is letting your wife know, hey, I'm safe right now. I'm having a hard time. I'm getting a little bit stressed out and I'm feeling triggered. And this is what's happening to me. Like, communicating, and getting the resources that you need, and vectoring to that visual flight conditions. And I think that's really great that you made that correlation. It's just like 3 things. You can remember 3 things. And maybe that's where people in crisis are. Maybe they can remember 3 things. I know when I was on a critical incident, I most certainly did not remember Jumpstart. I remembered 3 things.
Right. And it's because you're cognitively overloaded, just like your autonomic and your sympathetic nervous system are going to get out of balance. Like, if you can remember 3 things, and I like that. I think we can definitely build a campaign around it. And obviously it started on this podcast, Nick, with your idea. So I'm not going to take any credit of that. I think we can massage that to see what it looks like. But I think we just found a new sticker, a new slogan, a new challenge coin. I mean, I love that, because if we can teach people 3 things on how to do and what to do in crisis, those are the hardest things, and knowing what to do in crisis. I may not be able to do anything else, but if I remember these 3 things, and they're on water bottles and on stickers and they're visible, like, all I can, all we can hope for really is that someone will utilize those tools and techniques. And we do. We see that in aviation every day. And we also see in aviation when they're not followed, right? And we end up having a sentinel event or a fatality, and that sucks. So, and sometimes it's out of control, but this mental health, destigmatizing, normalizing, having these conversations, learning how to check in with your buddy and the ways to do that, the rights, the wrongs, and things to maybe avoid. Those are all good things that I think you can find those resources. I know that at least at Mind the Frontline, we have those resources, and I'm sure there's others out there. So I'm not always just saying like we're the best or we're the end of the road. I think you always keep your perspective wide, just like I teach critical medicine. It's just, always vet your resources, make sure it's coming from a good place. And then from there, if it works for you, incorporate it into your practice. And that's just one more thing we can do. We can become better mental health mentors and coaches and provide that. And you're right. Everybody on the department, that would be my dream world, brother. Like, hey, having everybody with an agency at least have basically like their CPR, right? Like you can at least do the basic stuff. And it may just be those three things. Just, hey, help them level wings out, help them communicate or communicate with them and then navigate and get them the resources that they need. And if we can just do that at all levels of the administration and the organization, that's making a difference. Now we can take that a step further of, okay, now we got to layer up, right? Like this is a little bit beyond the CPR. Now we're going to need some ACLS or advanced life support. We need the paramedics to show up or the physicians. I'll bring my doctor's stethoscope, even though I'm not a doctor, but I got a doctor's stethoscope. But, at the same time, like, we got to be able to kind of learn like, okay, we got to bring another layer here. And then, yes, sometimes it goes all the way to the mental health professionals and the clinical psychologists and the people like Tanya Glenn and Associates where, that's the level. But if we have all these chains in sequence and they're all firing correctly, talk about the impact that we could actually have on the suicide rates. That is hopefully where Mind the Frontline gets to.
Yeah, and I know at the peak of the mental health program that I saw at that last department was every new member got mental health first aid, which was a training that happened over 8 hours. They got the initial basics of it. They had a peer support team that got much more robust, and then they had a mental health clinician that was actually, this is all funded by the city for the department. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. It's kind of parallel what we see in 911.
Yeah, that's good. What we see in 911, I mean, this is what first responders are usually, adapted to, whether you're a dispatcher, law enforcement officer, ski patroller, corrections officer listening to these podcasts, we're all very similar in how we do things. And hopefully my hope is, typically, we take care of our own because they're in our immediate circle. But right, like if I had another law enforcement officer that would approach me or I saw some of the signs, I would apply the same principles and concepts to that individual because they're very similar and open up that communication. And this is where that community really does help. Nick, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on the show today. Any last thoughts as we kind of close out and wrap up today's episode?
Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Just know that this isn't a linear journey for anyone. So if you're listening to this and you're a 35-year veteran and you want to get into it, please, like we need folks from all levels being involved in something like this. If you're just getting into the career, do some research, do some reading. In October when our book comes out, read a little bit about what's going on, know what you're getting yourself into. Just like Chris had mentioned with vetting your resources, prepare yourself, prepare your brain, your mind, your spirit for jumping into this career field because it's going to pay dividends down the line to keep you healthy and involved for a long time. And that's really what we want, is a long, healthy workforce that has a career that you can, look back on and enjoy a happy, healthy life afterwards too.
Yeah, and hopefully have a great public safety career and a good marriage or relationship with your spouse or your kids while you're going through it. So thank you again, Nick. I really appreciate it. So as we approach the end of another enlightening episode of Critical Conversations by Mind the Frontline, I would absolutely like to express my sincere gratitude to Nick Carson for coming on today's show, sharing his thoughts, his knowledge, and his experience when we're talking about how to deal with patients who die in our care and just overall death in the emergency medicine services or public safety in general. I absolutely believe that your knowledge, especially, when we are able to shake out that IIMC for mental health, I think that's going to be a really cool initiative. And I think we need to get some power behind that. So thank you very much for sharing that idea and that thought. Let's continue to have these critical conversations together so we can continue to build a stronger, more resilient first responder community. Thank you for being a part of this episode of Critical Conversations by Mind the Frontline. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and mind the front line.
To our dedicated listeners, thank you again for joining us on this critical journey. Remember, the Critical Conversations podcast is a steadfast resource for police, fire, EMS, allied healthcare workers, dispatchers, air medical, and military personnel, along with their families. Your support makes the impact of these conversations resonate even further. If you found today's discussion enlightening and want to stay connected with our ongoing mission, please be sure to subscribe to the Critical Conversations podcast. You can find us via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and the Mind the Frontline website. Your subscription ensures that you will never miss an episode, and it's a powerful way to show your commitment to fostering resilience within the entire first responder community. For more information and additional resources, visit our website at www.mindthefrontline.org. Together, let's continue these critical conversations and build a stronger, more resilient first responder family. We thank you for being a part of the Critical Conversations podcast. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and mind the front line.